Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's open mic for HCL OneTest. My name is Kim Swain. I'll be your moderator. I'd like to go over just a couple quick housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, the session is being recorded, so if you prefer not to participate in the recorded session, please go ahead and drop from the call now. Also, during the webinar, we encourage you to type your questions in the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And then following the webinar, we'll take a minute to review some of those questions that came in. And then at the end of the webinar today, you're going to be prompted to answer a short 3-question survey. We'd greatly appreciate it if you would take just a couple of minutes to respond to that. All right, so thanks again for taking the time to join us. We hope you enjoy the webinar. I'm going to hand things over to Steve to get us started. Steve?
Hi, yes, thanks. So welcome everyone to, this is certainly my first one that I've done of these, but I have practiced, I promise. So what I'm going to talk about today is using the web URL schema in HCL OneTest API. A very short piece about me. So my name is Steve. I work in technical support for the OneTest suite of tools. I've worked on these products a very long time, and in fact from the days when we were a small company called Green Hat Software Limited, and I think I was employee number 6. A quick introduction into what I'm going to talk about. The web URL schema is a way that we can introspect URLs from web requests. Sounds a bit obvious. We can split portions of the URL up, and we can dynamically generate them for tests. And obviously when you're receiving a request into a stub, we can look at different parts of the URL and we can do things like tagging and filtering. I'm not going to go massive on slides, it will mostly be a demo. One thing I will also show you is that in 10.0.2 we added an additional feature called path template filtering in the stub portion of an operation. So this gives you additional flexibility when you're trying to route messages to your various stubs. This URL schema is used a lot now, and it's probably something that's happened in the background. You haven't actually worked with it in a manual fashion. You synchronize with various sources, but increasingly requests are sending their data in the URL. So if you've ever looked at URL in your browser, when you've hit the go button in some application, you will have noticed that as well as the host name and the port number and some URL that you're going to, there might have been other parameters that are sent in that URL. And quite often actually there's no body sent in the message, so a lot of this stuff is purely done in the URL. So as I mentioned, you might not have come across this schema, but there might be applications that you need to work with, you need to create tests for, or you need to create stubs for. And you might have to manually engineer these things because you don't have something to synchronize with. So for example, and I'll show you an example of this, if the API that or the server that you're talking to has got a published API using, say, a Swagger document, you can synchronize with that, and that will create you your services and your operations in architecture school, and it will also create your web URL schemas. But for some applications, it may be that there's no published schema for it, so you might be asked to manually construct these things. So we can see in this slide that I'm showing you a couple of examples, and I will build these in the demo. So the first one is using query parameters. So again, you might have noticed this kind of thing going on in your browser. So we're passing 2 parameters with 2 values, and you start off with some kind of fixed portion of the URL, and then you add them on using the question mark and the ampersand to separate them. Something that we've had from more than one customer is they're trying to solve the problem which is shown in the second example. So they have a URL which changes in the middle somewhere. So obviously query parameters get stuck on the end of the URL, but you might have an application where some middle portion of that URL is actually changing. So the example I'm showing here is that there might be a customer ID that is obviously completely variable. So how can we handle that? I'm going to briefly show you the quality server Phonebook example just to get us going, and that's a good way to start with the web URL schema. And this is a application that's running for you, a web service that's running in quality server that you can play around with to learn this technology. If you have to manually create these, you create them in Schema Library, and we'll go on to have a look at that. But the image that I'm showing you there is where we've synchronized with that Phonebook application, so you can see some examples that it gives you automatically. When we create them ourselves, we start off with a template name, and then we can create one or more URL schemas underneath that. And this is basically showing you that you have the option for fixed path segments on the left-hand side, and then you can add your queries on the right-hand side. But again, I'll go on to show a worked example of that. Something that's a little bit different about this schema is you're probably familiar with operations, and you would have a request and a reply, and you would apply the schema to the request and a schema for the reply. This one's slightly unusual in that you can apply two schemas to the request. So you would first apply the URL schema, and then you will additionally see that you've then got the option to apply another schema for the body. Now, I did say at the outset that generally with this stuff, you don't send anything in the body, but there's nothing to stop you sending a body. So some information in the body, as well as some information in the URL. But again, hopefully I'll make that a bit more obvious when we come to the demo. And a quick shot there of how this is going to appear. So once you're using the web URL schema, you will actually see the different portions of URL are actually shown in the message editing portion, which appears to be the body, but you'll notice underneath you've got the body. So again, this is where you could have two schemas. So you've got the resource path, and you can see that it's parameterized by these squiggly bracket parameters. And then below, that's been transposed down into a more human readable format where you can just type in the values you want, and they will get substituted in at runtime. So I did promise not too many slides. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show you the Phonebook example, which we supply. So that's going to work for you, assuming you've got access to Quality Server. And then I'm going to go through creating two different types of web URL schema. So the one where the customer ID can change, so something that changes in the middle section of URL. And also I'm going to show you how you can use query parameters, and I'll show you how I can use these in tests and in stubs. So let me get my OneTest API on screen. Right, okay. So I'm using a fairly recent version of HCL OneTest API. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the Phonebook example. So I'm going to get my browser. And just before I do that, the run through that I'm going to give you is, roughly speaking, it's covered in this knowledge article, Okay, so there are many knowledge articles that are being added to the database. And what we try and do with these is we try and give you worked examples, or we might obviously be giving you some help with an error message. So these are to supplement the standard documentation, and they're for more specific examples. Okay, so in order to prevent the documentation perhaps getting too massive, going into too much detail, we supplement it with these. Generally what we would do is add a reference to the actual knowledge center, the actual documentation, and then we can show you a step-by-step worked example. And sometimes we might have a sample project as well added as an attachment. Okay, so I'm not going to run through that whole thing, but there is, I think, yes, there is. So on this one, I did actually include an example project, which gives you the kind of finished article if you'd run through these steps. So that's roughly what I'm going to do, so you can refer back to that later on. So as mentioned, the first thing I need to do is show you the Phonebook example in HCL Quality Server. So I just need to log into that. Type the right password. Right, so we have various examples. This is the home landing page. Obviously, you can click on examples, or you can also find them if you're in, so supposing you're in another page and you want to get to examples, you can do help and examples. So it takes you to the same, I'll just prove that to you, it takes you to the same place, right? Okay, so there are various examples on here, but probably I think this is the only one on here that's got a user interface. So if I click on that, I'll just start a new tab. So you've actually got some editing capabilities here. So we start off when you boot up Quality Server, we start off with 2 people in the Phonebook, but you can actually add, quite easily, you can add new ones. Okay, and you can delete them, you can edit them. But the key to this is that we can access this using the REST API. So what I'm going to show you, if I go back to the examples page, the other one that I tend to use quite a lot is the calculator example. So that offers you various mathematical functions, and both of these services are running if you've got Quality Server running, but that wouldn't use the web URL. So I'm going to take this one to demonstrate the web URL. And you can see there that we've got various schemas to define this service. So I'm going to go with the Swagger definition. So if I click on that, you can actually see the JSON that Swagger definition is written in. Now there's 2 ways I can import this into OneTest API. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take the URL, but you could actually save that to a file and then load in the JSON file. So if we go back to the application, I need to go to Architecture School. And so what we're going to do is add a Swagger definition. So like I say, you can paste in the URL. Alternatively, you can save that JSON to a file and browse to the file. Right, so when you synchronize with these kind of sources, so a WSDL or a Swagger definition, this puts you into a wizard. I'm not going to step through it, but you could potentially create tests and stubs for each of the operations in there. I'm just going to click finish for brevity. Now, if we go to so if we go to what that's actually imported, so in logical view, that's imported our, it's called API actually, which is perhaps not obvious. So that's created our operations, and it's created us a transport. So the transport is going to point to quality server if I find the physical resource. Yeah, okay. So you'll notice that that is the same thing that I had in my browser. So if I go to my browser, you'll notice that that's, so it's got that host name and that port number. And it's created us these operations. So let's just have a quick look at one of those operations. So this is what I was talking about, where you might not have come across the web URL because it's all been done for you under the covers. So if we take this example operation, which is to read an entry from the Phonebook, the synchronization process has created this logical picture of the application, and it's applied the Phonebook schema, the web URL schema, to the request. And as I mentioned, often the case that there's no data being passed in the body, so there's no schema for that. But actually we do have a schema, a JSON schema for the response. You can see that it's a get operation. And you'll notice that the resource path there is blank, and that's because the URL or resource path is being defined by this. So to prove that to you, what I'm going to do is go to Test Factory. Okay, so Test Factory will put you in the same place that you were. So the same thing that you've got selected in Architecture School, it should keep that for you when you go to Test Factory. So Test Factory is where we're going to make some tests. So let's make an MEP test for that. So I should call it the same name, right? So I don't get confused. Well, you'll notice that the test is created under that folder. So you can call it what you like, really. But I do have a bad temptation of calling all my tests MEP. And then when I run them, I've run a test called MEP, but I can't remember without looking into it what it was for. So if we look at the send request, which every time I do that, it goes on a different window. Right. The send request, it's constructing the URL from the web URL schema, and I'll show you that in a minute. So you remember we had a get method. So all this has been pulled out by the synchronization with the Swagger document. And you'll notice that at the end there, it might be a bit small, but we've got ID in squiggly brackets, so that's a dynamic portion. And down here, I can just say, well, I want to look up ID1. So if we just quickly refresh ourselves of the people in the Phonebook, sorry, people in the Phonebook, I've got 1, 2, and 3, so I'm going to go with ID1. And if I run that test, right, so don't be put off by the fact that that's failed. That has failed because I didn't configure the receive part of the test with any data. So by default, it was expecting nothing to come back. And actually, if I click on, you can click on any of those validate entries and it will launch this message difference window. Yeah, so on the left-hand side, this is what I configured in the test. So I didn't configure anything. And it's saying, well, you expected nothing, but you've got all these values back, and hopefully you'll see that Mr. Fred Jones is the person that was in the first entry. Okay. So what I can do there is overwrite expected message. We've got a few options there, close and rerun. So now that test passes. Okay. So a couple of other things. You can see in this test console, you can see actually what was sent. So you can see the one was appended to the URL. Again, you can click on that entry and you can see a bit more detail on what was sent. So you can see the URL that was sent. You can see it was a GET operation. And you can see some of the other headers that get set, but we're not explicitly setting any. So these are created by the code libraries. And again, you can see the web URL portion that's been split out using the web URL schema. So if we go back to have a look at the web URL schema itself, so for that I need to go to Architecture School and I need to go to Schema Library, obviously enough. Yeah, so I've done this twice in this same project, so I've got 2 copies of everything, but basically they're both the same. So if we take the one that I was interested in, which was get entry, you can see that's how it's constructed. Okay, so I'm going to make one of those in a minute for a clean application. So you don't need to take too much notice of that. Right, so what I'm going to do now is go with my new application. So to do that, I need to create a general service component. I'm going to call it Open Mic. Right, so we get a new folder appearing there. So within that, I want to create my, we're going to have 2 operations actually. So the first one, I'm going to call it ID. So this is where we have the varying customer ID. And the second one, I'm going to call that one, I don't know, query parameters. Right, now, obviously to be able to talk to anything, I'm going to need a transport. So again, this is all handled for you when you do a synchronization, but I'm going to have to manually create everything. So again, right click, and we want a web HTTP connection. So I'm going to call it 9876 because that's the port number that I tend to use for my examples. Now don't forget that at the moment that's not actually configured. So this is a logical representation, and with transports you have a mapping to a physical transport, and that mapping is dependent on your environment. So we're in the environment called test env. I'll just show you I've only got one environment. And you have this concept of bindings where you bind the logical transport to a physical transport. So you can change that in there and you can add different environments. So if you want to run this project, for example, talking to a different set of servers in a different environment, you create a new environment, you create new physical transports, and then you point to those when you switch to that other environment. So for example, you could have a dev environment with one set of servers, you could have a UAT environment with another set of servers. 99.9% of your project is the same, you just create different mappings for the actual physical connections, because obviously the servers are going to be in different places in each environment. So the last thing I need to do on this transport is to edit it to say the host is going to be my own machine, and that's my port number. Right, okay. I'll come back to that because now at this point I need to create myself the web URL schema that I can then apply to these operations. And at that point I'll tie them into the transport. So when you're adding schemas in here, you click this drop down box and I want web URL. And again, I'm going to have a overarching name as open mic. So in here, what you can do, I'm not going to do it, but you can have a kind of prefix. So I could say, I could do this, right? So that every one of these templates that I create starts off with that part of the URL and then gets lengthened by the extra template, but I'm not going to do that, but that is an option. Right, so I'm going to create the ID one first. So we just give it a name. And then we need to construct that URL. So the format of this URL, I'll just put it in this comment. So it's going to be /customer/ and then the ID, and then for some reason it's going to have a verb on it, so it's going to have status. Okay, so that's what it's going to look like. So a path segment, first of all, it's going to have the literal part of that. Now you've got a couple of options here. These get concatenated together. So I could do this, for example. So that would be /customer/, and you can see this kind of preview as you add these entries. Or I could make it a bit simpler and just put /customer/ on there. You get the same result. So the next bit of this can vary. So that's parameterized, and I'm going to call it ID. Okay, so you'll notice it's got brackets on it, and then I have another fixed portion on the end. Right, so that's that one done. And the other one I was going to create was query params. So again, starts off in a similar way. So we have /customer. I'm not going to have the trailing slash for that one because there's no actual fixed part to go on the end. So the rest of this is going to be query segments. So for this, I'm going to say I want to get someone's name, and I'm going to call the variable name. I mean, that can be anything, but it just makes sense to keep these the same. Okay, so again, you can see this being built up for you. So when it comes to editing things, it's going to be called name, and we're going to have age. And again, it's parameterized, so I'm going to stick that in the variable age. Right, okay, so we've created our two web URL schemas, and you can select them and preview them in here. Oh, sorry, there's a drop-down box. If you've got a lot of these, you can basically do show all and then select from that tree. But you don't tend to do much in this, to be honest. Right, so if I go back to logical view, let's make things a bit simpler. Right, so let's do the ID one to start with. So let's edit that operation. So first things first, you need to tell OneTest API what transport you're going to use so that it knows what kind of schemas you could have in here. For example, if I was using an IBM MQ transport, then it wouldn't make any sense to have web URLs on there. So I'm going to use my 9876 transport. So like I say, you don't often find yourself doing this nowadays because this has been done from some sort of schema synchronization. But it is good to know how to do it manually because you might need to modify those that you've already got. I'm going to say we're going to use an HTTP GET method. And I'm going to select my nice new schema, which is, so I've got which one I'm doing, ID, right, okay, so we want open mic and we want the ID web schema. Right, okay, and you'll notice that then we got the option to set the body schema, but I don't need to do that. Right, so that's that one done. Just the other thing I was going to point out while we're in here, which may not be familiar to you. So when we have an operation, we have this thing called message exchange pattern. So probably if you've been creating tests using MEP, you might never have wondered what it stood for. It's message exchange pattern. So this operation, if you were to create a test, you would send a request and receive a reply. So the message exchange pattern is I send a request with this schema, I get a reply with this schema, and I'm using this transport. We also have a stub tab, which I'll come onto in a minute. So if you were to create a stub, obviously it's the opposite way around. The stub is going to receive a request and send a reply. Don't need to worry about that too much. So what I'm going to do is create myself a test and a stub. So you notice this has now appeared in here, so I can do test using MEP. And let's have a look at that. So yeah, this is similar to the one what we have with the Phonebook, but it's just that I've got the dynamic part in the middle. So let's assume the customer's ID is lots of 9s. Now, I need something to talk to, so I've obviously invented this application and this web server running on port 9876, but there isn't actually anything running on that. So I'm going to need a stub to respond to this request. So let's go with stub using MEP. Right, okay. So again, you'll notice that it's applied the schema. So that gives us the option of extracting the ID that's coming into the stub. We could also do sort of guard conditions. We could decide, well, if that ID is less than 1,000, then I want the stub to respond. If it's greater than 1,000, I want to pass it on to the real system. I'm not going to go into that complexity now, but this is what this schema allows you to do. So a very basic stub, if you're not familiar, it's an input message and it's an output message, so we call that the activity tab. So by default, we just send the message back. If you want to do something a bit more complicated, you switch on business logic, which is way over here. So if you switch on business logic, so if you just select that, it doesn't really do anything apart from change the display. And by changing the display, it actually tells you what the stub is going to do on the output side. So you've now got a separate, whereas this is just showing you an output message. If you select business logic, you can see, oh, look, it's a send reply. And if you click on it, that's the same as what we had in the basic view. So you might think, what's the point of doing that? Well, it allows you to add other actions. So as a simple example, what I'm going to do is we're going to keep a copy of that part of the URL that comes in. So I'm going to do a quick tag. And when you do a quick tag in a received message, it basically creates you a tag in the tag store with the same name as the field name. And it adds a store action. So we're going to store that value into the ID tag. So what we could do is we could send that back in the response. So I could then say, or you can have that back as a response. Other things you could do is you could log it to the console. So I could do a log action and say received ID. And you might want to do that before you send the reply, so you can change the order. So I'm going to run that stub. Okay, and you can see it's listening on my machine's IP address and 9876. And it's listening for GET requests, because don't forget HTTP can have many different types of requests: GET, POST, PATCH. Right, let's have a tidy up, and I'm going to run this test that we created earlier. Right, so good news is the stub's taken a hit in a good way, and sure enough, it's printed out in the console the ID that it received. It sent it back to my test, which again, don't forget, I hadn't configured the test to expect anything, so it's saying, well, you expected nothing, but you got 99999 back. So just as a simple example, I will change the value to a load of 2s, rerun the test. Right, okay, so this time I got lots of 2s. So I sent 2s in the middle and I got 2s back. Right, so let's do a quick one on the query parameters. So if I go back to architecture school, don't forget I haven't configured this operation yet, it's completely blank. So I'll need to set the transport, the schema, which is open mic, query parameters. Just the only other thing, I need to change it to a get. I don't have to, but just thought I'd keep it simple. Right, so that's that done. Hopefully I'm not going too quick for you. So let's have a tidy up. If you right click, you've got various options here to, if you don't want to keep clicking on loads of tabs. So I can tidy that up, and let's create a new test. I don't want to keep typing that, so I'll just call it QP. And this time we've now got 2 parameters that I can put in there. I could type properly. For some reason it's hidden the message header. Yeah, so there we go. And let's make ourselves a stub. Call that QP as well. Right, okay, so we've got the 2 parameters here. So here's another tip for you. If you wanted to tag both of those, if you multiple select and do quick tag, it does them both at once. And we'll just check the tag store. So you can see we've got the two tags. Another tip for you, you can switch various tags on or off. So if you don't want to see all the predefined ones, you can basically turn things, or you don't want to see the environment ones. So that can make your life a bit easier. Right, so we've got both of those. So I'm going to do the same thing I did last time. I'm just going to pass them back in the body. I won't switch on business logic, but so I'll just do it directly in here. So So if I right click and substitute the person's name and their age. Oops. Right, okay, so that should be ready to go. So let's run that stub. Have a tidy up. So don't forget, when you're in design mode in OneTest API, these run for 5 minutes, so sometimes you have to restart them. So I'm going to stop that stub and run the test. Right, okay, so we've got the activity on the stub, and sure enough, it's sent us back what we sent in. Right, let's just again have a tidy up. So I wanted to show you something to watch out for, which we have had a couple of support tickets on, and it's not immediately obvious when you see the problem. So I'm going to create another operation to demonstrate something. So new. Sorry, my mind had gone a blank there. I'm going to call it regex. You'll see why in a minute. Right, so don't forget we need to tell it what technology it's using. And I'm just going to choose one of the web URL schemas. It doesn't matter which one, but I'm going to go with that one. Right, okay. So where I'm going with this is, don't be tempted to put something in here. So you might think, oh, I want the, surely I want that in there. So I'll show you what happens if you do that. So if I create a test using this new operation, sorry, let's just tidy up. Right, so if I create a new test using that operation, you get this. And you might think, what on earth? So let's make that a bit bigger. Right, so what's happened there is we've got contradicting configuration, so it can't resolve it. So basically, if you think of the web URL schema, it wants to create a URL of the form /customer /something /status. And we've gone and put /customer in, so it's saying that what you've got there doesn't match the schema. So if you click OK, it will create you a test, but you've ended up with a fixed URL and you've lost your schema. So like I say, you probably won't come across this because you won't be tempted to change that. But then again, you might be tempted to change it, and I'll show you why. So if I run, let's run one of my stubs again. You'll notice that it's listening on requests for that definition, which is the host name and the port number. When you run a stub, if you're connected to quality server, it sends a message to quality server to say, these are the messages that this stub is interested in. So if you were running the HTTP proxy and messages came through the proxy downloads that rule from quality server and it will divert matching messages to the stub. So at the moment, this stub is listening for any request on port 9876, and we can just, there's another way to view it. So if you go to quality server, and let's go back. Right, if you go to the network page, right, so you'll see all your routing rules here. This one, this icon denotes that you've got a stub running. Basically, again, it's confirming that that is listening for any GET request, so it's not looking at the URL at all. So that stub could be responding or capturing messages that is far too broad. So where am I going with this? You've probably forgotten. You're going to need to limit that almost certainly. So if I go to architecture school, so let's choose the ID operation. So yeah, so this is where people might be tempted to edit this. So where's it getting that from? Because this is blank, and because this gets mirrored to the stub configuration, the stub is configured for any URL. So you can change that not by editing this, but if you go to the stub tab, to enable the configuration in here, you have to select the transport. So obviously we want the same transport. And now you've got all sorts of options as to what that stub is actually going to listen for. So we've already got the GET operation. So if you sent a post request, that would be ignored by the stub. But we've got this option here. So now we can decide, well, actually, I only want this stub to respond to anything that starts with /customer. And you've got various options here. So you can say, well, allow subpaths. So we would want that, wouldn't we? Because we've got an ID that comes after that. So let's just change that and rerun the stub and see what that does for us. Right, so I'm going to stop that stub, and you'll notice I haven't got to edit the stub at all. I've just edited the operation, and when the stub starts, it should pick up that new config. Right, so there you go. So you'll now notice it's /customer, and if I go to my browser, you'll notice that this is now got a new rule. The other thing that this is good for debugging on is the recipient side. It tells you where messages will actually get routed to. So again, if you're using the proxy looks at this rule. It says, right, I'm looking for GET requests on this port going to this host with this URL. If I get one, where do I send it to? And it's there. But that could be on a different machine. If you're running this stub in an agent on a different machine, that could be a completely different machine. Could even be a different port number. But yeah, this is very good for debugging. If your stubs are not getting messages, then this is the first place to look. What rule am I publishing, and where is the stub running? Right, okay, so that's that. So let's just check that the stub's still, sorry, I just clicked on the wrong thing. Right, let's just check that we can still hit it using our ID message. Right, okay, so the stub is still happy with that because we've sent /customer/ a load of stuff on the end of it. So this new feature, we had a request from customers who've got this kind of format of URL. And if we go with the current usage, this stub would respond to /customer/ anything. And you might actually want your stub to only respond to customer something status. So the way to do that is if I just stop the stub using this relatively new feature. So again, we need to go to the stub tab. And we've got this new thing called path template. So again, we can wildcard sections of the URL. So you use squiggly brackets, doesn't matter what I call it really, /status. Right, so now if I run that stub, so tidy up. Right, you'll notice it's exactly replicated what I've put in there, but that is not literally looking for ID. It's looking for anything in the middle. So we'll just check the rule. So again, we've now got this different rule. So let's send my request in, make sure it still works. Yeah, so it still works, it's still responding. So to prove it, what I'll do is I'll make a test that I know won't work. So for example, we could send the query parameter test in. Now you might think that's a bit of a strange thing to happen. Why has the test passed? Now keep a note on the hit count on the stub, and I'll run that test again. So you notice the count didn't go up, but I got a response. So how did that happen then? Well, let's have a look at what we did actually get back in the response. So we actually got an error status. So basically the code in the stub is basically said, well, I haven't got any matching stubs. So if I was to validate the response to be a 200, then that test would fail. So that is actually working correctly. So I'm just trying to think. So let's just run the, I'm going to do one last thing before I finish off. I'm going to run the, have a tidy up. So I've got both stubs running now. So let's just make sure the query parameters, yeah, so you noticed because this stub has got this, specific filtering on, now that won't, the query parameter message won't go to that stub. It's gone to the query parameter stub. And the only reason that's failed is because I wasn't expecting the data to come back. So a quick summary then of what we've been through. By all means, use the quality server Phonebook if you want to have a play around. There's also the calculator application, which you can synchronize with, but that doesn't have the web URL. We've been through manually creating your schema. So if we just go back to Schema Library in case you've forgotten it. So you can manually create your schemas in here. You can have combinations of fixed portions of the URL. You can have changing portions of the fixed URL if you like. And you can also have query segments. So you could combine those all in one web URL schema if you wanted to. Then it's a fairly simple job of applying those to your operation. Don't be tempted to change the resource path. And then if you want to limit the types of URLs that the stub responds to, then you've got various options in the stub portion. And you've even got further options. You can also filter on HTTP headers as well. So that is me done, unless anyone's got any questions.
I think we did have a couple questions. Looks like, how do you find knowledge articles?
Yeah, that's good. Okay. So back to my browser. Yeah, so just to recap, this was the kind of walkthrough that I was pointing you to, but yeah, a good point. How would you find it? So One way to do it is to, if you start off here, which is hcltechsoftware.com, if you go to resources and I think it's support. So this is where you would go if you want to log a support call. Ask someone in the community, or if you click on this knowledge here. So obviously now this is for all of our products, and there's a lot of them now. So if you look at this this filter list down here, there is quite a lot of stuff. So let's go through. I don't know if this is going to work. You put me on the spot now. Right. Okay. So web URL has actually come up with quite a lot of stuff. So how can I limit that to the products that are relevant? So we're actually in the DevOps space. So if I click on DevOps and a OneTest API, that's limited this display. So actually I've written two here. Yeah, so that one there is the one. Oh, and there's this one as well. So let's have a look at that one. So have a look at that one. Yeah, so that one actually covers the error that I showed you, which was if you start changing the resource path, you can give yourself a nasty looking error message. Yeah, so hopefully that's helped. So yeah, you basically start off on here and then work your way down. You can also just browse. So if you want to just look at things, you know, like release notes and stuff, you can just select the. I'm not sure if I need to refresh that, to be honest. Let's go to knowledge search. Right, let's go to knowledge search, get everything. Yeah, and then you can filter it that way. So you can just go to whichever project you want. Okay, I've covered that I've done that one to death. Is there anything else?
Just real quick, we do have one other. Can you combine both stubs into one?
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, so you can. So if we go back to here, so you'll notice I've got two separate stubs. So you could create a new blank stub. And you can add your events, but they don't have to be from the same operation. So I could say, I'll have that one, thanks. And then I'll have that one as well. Okay. So obviously you'd have to configure them as I did before, but yeah, it's quite legal to have different operations in the same stub. I'm not going to set it up and test it, but yes, that's quite easy. Okay. Anything else from anyone?
No other questions. I did unmute everyone, so if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, I think we're at the end of our time. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we're okay. But so yeah, thank you, Steve. I think that'll be it for today. We appreciate you guys taking the time to join us. I will send out the recording of this in the next day or so. So if you have any questions after viewing the recording or that come up later, please feel free to let me know, and I'll make sure to connect you with a member of the team. I think that's it. Thanks all. Have a great day.